I wonder what the dreaming dingo was thinking as he struggled against the finality of death. He may have heard the moon laughing in triumph, and I imagine he poured forth a great howling lamentation as he disappeared forever. But at the same time, he would have heard his mates. Their voices, raised in the haunting harmonies of dingoes, kept calling, "Come back, come back." Their penetrating songs would have accompanied him into his death, their voices mingling with his, and holding the songs of grief aloud in the world, even as their mate died. Well, similarly, but not identically, there was Job. Betrayed, abandoned, isolated by God. He calls out to God, and for a long time there's no answer. And I'll quote, "I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I wait, but you do not consider me." When I think of Job and the dingo as two creatures who shared a similar experience, the contrast heightens Job's loneliness. The first abandonment was the wager in which God decided to experiment with him, destroying his fields and flocks and killing all his children. The second abandonment was the isolation. Who called to him in his sorrow? Who offered comfort? Who was there for him? His wife encouraged him in his longing for death, and his three self-righteous friends lost all empathy or compassion. The friends wanted to sustain their sense of God by telling Job that Job must be wrong. And Job was willing to say, maybe I'm wrong, but tell me, just tell me what it is. And God wouldn't answer. We can listen to Job's words as a call for connection, that God not isolate him, and that the world not abandon him in his sorrow. And as far as the story tells us, his cries fell into emptiness. The spotlight was on him, and he was alone. Reflecting on this loneliness and abandonment, my thoughts shift toward Aboriginal ways of managing dying. In the community where I lived, in Yarralin, when a person was near death, old Tim, the clever man, would go after their spirit, calling them to come back, doing the dingo word, come back, he would be saying. And he would return with a report, either bringing the spirit back to the body for a time, or telling all the crying relations that the person really was going into death, and that this really was it. With each death and each funeral, people cry out in anguish, drawing others into the region of death and dying, so that no one in that torn space is isolated or silenced. And through all the anger, the negotiation and conflict, and all the invocations of loss and love, conveyed through songs and tears and calls of sorrow, funerals reach out to the individuality of the dead person, to their country, and to the spirits that may be walking about, to the dreamings that take notice, to the family, to the custodians of the dead, to the stories like the dingo and the moon. All this grieving reaches out into the death space. And if life is truly finished, then all this grieving seeks a response from the living, seeks voices that howl in sympathy and assure us all that neither the living nor the dying have been abandoned. This is a sharing of grief, so as to soothe the throbbing emptiness left in the country and in the family and in the world more generally. Shared grief brings death into the world of life. The worst funeral I ever experienced shone a spotlight on the loneliness that arises when the sharing of grief breaks down. Some Pentecostal missionaries had brought into our region a way of thinking about death that was not only foreign, but I think inhuman. The idea was that we should rejoice because our brother or sister had gone to heaven, that better world, that home on high, where they could finally join Jesus and live in eternal bliss. There were many terrible funerals. The worst one became chaotic because the missionaries and their followers were running one kind of funeral, and the rest of the people, the unconverted folk, were running another kind of funeral, and it was all happening in the same time and place. So when Molly, the oldest wife of the dead man, threw herself violently onto the ground, crying and sobbing, there was no one there to cushion her or hold her. And when people started to bang their heads, where were the relations who would restrain them? I shall never forget Molly's look when she realized that her grief was not being responded to. Abandoned in that moment, like Job in his misery, she was suddenly naked in the shock of realization that her world had just fallen to pieces, not only because her husband of a lifetime had died, but now again, and even more shatteringly, because her grief found no response. The lamentation that should have called forth harmonies fell into an unfathomable silence. I was beside myself with anguish, both for Molly and for her husband, a man I respected enormously. The cacophonous event had set us all on edge, with the missionaries telling people that they weren't allowed to cry because we're meant to rejoice. And we who should have been helping the old man through death were stumbling and mishandling everything. The thought of his spirit trying to find its way back into country with no harmonies to carry it along was awful. And my consolation was in feeling certain that this terrible event was not the final story, that once the missionaries were gone and their funeral was over, the real work of singing him home could begin. And that is what happened. Well, stories of the moon and the dingo also tell the story of what happens after death. Yes, death is final in the sense that the persons or dingoes never return as themselves. But at the same time, various spirits continue to live, and some will return in other bodies, other lives, other families, perhaps even other countries, but definitely moving through other species to find their way back into country and life again. As old Tim explained it, that kid finds a new father, a new mother. That's the dingo law. The dead man looks around and thinks about his dreaming, makes himself into kangaroo, goanna, bird, crocodile. That's the law from that dog. Well, one's life will be extinguished, but life itself is a process of ongoing cross-species transformations, and as participants in that process, human beings share in its continuity. Part of the importance of singing the person into death and then on into their home country is to ensure that death is not so final, that people or dogs remain where they belong, and that death is turned back toward life, even though the individual will never experience the self-same life. Job's situation was different. Stephen Mitchell's translation, which is just so beautiful, but he didn't translate the whole book, unfortunately. But I just love this passage that expresses Job's dilemma perfectly. Like a cloud fading in the sky, man dissolves into death. He leaves the world behind him and never comes home again. In Norm Habel's insightful Earth reading, he suggests that Job is longing to return at peace within the earth because this earth place, Sheol, as Habel interprets it, is not a lonely shadow land, but actually rather is a place where people are securely sheltered from the capricious cruelty of heaven. Well, Job's longing for return to earth can also be imagined in the context of ancestor veneration. Archaeologist and historian Rachel Hallote talks about how in ancient times there was all this communication between the living and the dead. The dead bodies were put with their ancestors, or they were buried in the fields, or they were buried under the houses. And you don't read about that in the Bible because the Bible's written all that out as paganism. But the archaeologists show that it was entirely contemporary with the biblical stories that don't tell us that that was what was going on. And that keeping of the dead in contact and communication with the living ensured that the dead still had a presence as members of the family, had a concern about the crops, had a concern about the future. But it required then descendants. It required a family to keep the dead in communion with the living. The house of Job had been thriving, and it was the whole house that God had wiped out when he killed all the sons and daughters and all the flocks and crops that would have provided for them. So it seems to me that God abandoned Job severely in that way as well, because with no descendants there would be no living people to hold open his connection with the living world. Once dead, he would be dead twice over, first having lost his place as a living member in the world of life, and then losing the possibilities of connections with the living world after his death. When God destroyed all Job's people and crops and animals. He stole Job's afterlife as well as his current life. Truly then, Job was isolated. There would be no one left to wail over him, no one to sing him into his grave, no future for him once his body died. And so God did what the moon did not manage to do to the dingo. He ruined Job's death, just as surely as he ruined his life. So there was Job, isolated and alone on his pile of ashes, scraping away at his suppurating flesh. We can't understand why people shunned him. But I imagine that when all Job's animals were killed, his house dogs as well as his flock dogs died. But then, as now, there were stray dogs roaming the streets and back alleys, some of them abandoned, some simply adventurous. What if one of them found Job and settled in beside him, sharing his food and the warmth of his campfire? Being a dog, she would not be too fussy about open sores and flaking skin, bad breath, or odors. More than that, she would see him not as a sickly shell, but as a full human. Looking into his eyes, she would probably see that in spite of all the rejection by God and by man, there was still the desire for connection that he had kept alive within the loneliness of his grief. Well, the dingo who was taunted by the moon had his dingo mates. Why should Job not have a dog? Let us call her Blackie in honor of the dark-colored guard dogs of the ancient world. She would lick Job's hands, wagging her tail and gazing at him with quick, dog-like devotion. Her gift was that she was not afraid of the deathful spotlight. Her ancestors had been here before her, and they had learned the truth of this place. They knew they would have to die, and they knew how to sing to their mates, calling them back or carrying them through into more life. In this space of wager and death, they sang the connections that crossed the abyss. Even if no one else was left to grieve for Job, and even though God seemed indifferent, Blackie would howl over his dead body and sing him into earth. So when God finally did appear with his whirlwind and his seemingly endless elaboration of his power, perhaps Job was not alone. Blackie, too, listened to God's voice as it emerged from the whirlwind. And she, too, heard echoes of the triumphalist moon as God extolled the enormity of his power. This is a very long section of the book in which God talks about how great he is. Where were you when I planned the earth? Tell me, if you are wise. Do you know who took its dimensions, measuring its length with a cord? What were its pillars built on? Who laid down its cornerstone, while the morning stars burst into singing and the angels shouted with joy? Blackie rested her head on Job's legs, and he draped his arm across her neck. They listened to God together, and their mateship enabled Job to understand something new. When Job acknowledged God's greatness, saying dryly, "I know, you can do everything," he may have been heaping blame on God in the way that Daly and others heap blame on the moon. At the same time, he was pointing out that there were things that God could not do. He was suggesting that God could not find a mate who would lick his hands and send him home. That awareness was possible because of Blackie. She gave an understanding of God's limits, and so Job was moved to recognize that God was so powerful that he had no true others. Like the moon, he would always win, but the price was utter loneliness. Job might have thought back to the Garden of Eden, to Adam and Eve, and he might have thought that when they ate the forbidden fruit and became like gods, a terrible loneliness descended upon them. God's curse was then a doubled curse. They would die, unlike God, and they would lose their understanding of and capability for being part of earth life. They would not know how to fit and would only know how to dominate. Thinking themselves to be all-powerful like gods, their awareness of mateship would be lost to them, and they would venture alone down ever more ghastly paths of utility, cruelty, and alienation. The Bible's story tells us that Job repented. I wonder if he was using God's language of power in order to communicate to God that he gave up his desire for knowledge, because the one thing about which he was now certain was that he did not want to be or be like God. Was Job able to see that to face death one needs earth mates? That the blessing of earth life is the comfort of others? Dog and human, as the Aboriginal stories tell us, know that the death space calls for mates, earthmates who will enter into terror and reach out to each other, and who will call out in all seriousness and with all willful intention, come back. Now, in this era of extinctions, we are in the midst of loneliness. Animals and plants, all our precious earthmates, are seemingly abandoned as they tumble into death. Their future generations are eradicated, and their deaths are treated as if they were superfluous. Who sings out to them? Or do their calls fall into a lonely death space where the powerful, enchanted with their own success and indifferent to disaster, turn away from the faces of others? Along with the activism required of us in these days of grief, let us not forget to keep singing. Come back, you gods of old earth, sun bear, moon bear, panda, polar, grizzly. Come back, you desert dwellers, bilby, potteroo, nailtail, bandicoot. Come back, you majestic singers, Texas gray, Japanese, southern rocky, timber wolf. Come back, dear mates, dear jackal, wild dog, dingo. As loneliness descends and the spotlight grows larger, come back or take us with you, but leave us not alone without you forever. Come back. Thank you.